Somewhere in ancient Egypt, there was a job so strange that if you described it to someone today, they'd assume you were joking. Your entire task, every single day, was to stand near the most powerful man in the country, covered head to toe in honey, and do absolutely nothing while insects crawled all over your body. This wasn't a punishment. It wasn't slavery in the way you might picture it. It was officially palace policy. Let's go back to who ordered this in the first place. His name was Pepi II. He became pharaoh of Egypt at 6 years old, during the 6th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, somewhere around 2278 BC, because he took the throne as a small child. His mother ruled in his place for years before he was old enough to govern on his own. And that upbringing, growing up with absolute power before he even understood what power was, seems to have shaped exactly the kind of ruler he became. Pepi II is remembered today for two things. First, his reign lasted an almost unbelievable length of time, somewhere between 60 and 94 years, depending on which historical source you trust. Either way, it's one of the longest reigns of any monarch in recorded history. Second, he is remembered for being spectacularly particular about his own comfort. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what being pharaoh actually meant at this point in Egyptian history. This was the tail end of the Old Kingdom, the era that gave us the Great Pyramids at Giza a few generations earlier. By the time Pepi II sat on the throne, the pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was considered a living god, a direct bridge between the divine world and the human one. Ordinary Egyptians weren't permitted to speak his birth name aloud. Every need he had, no matter how small, was treated as something that deserved a solution immediately, no matter the cost to anyone else involved. A 6-year-old inheriting that kind of authority is almost impossible to imagine today. There was no adjustment period, no gradual introduction to responsibility. One day you're a child, and the next, grown men who have lived entire lives are required to bow to you and obey your every instruction. His mother, Ankhesenaten Pepi II, ruled as regent in his early years, managing the kingdom until he was old enough to rule directly. But by all accounts, once Pepi II was fully in control, the habits of a child raised with unlimited authority never really left him. There's a record of him ordering the capture of a dancing pygmy from Central Africa purely to entertain him. And there's a record of something even stranger. Pepi II hated flies, not in the normal way people dislike flies. He seems to have been genuinely, deeply bothered by them landing anywhere near him, and rather than simply waving them away or using one of the woven fly whisks that Egyptians had already been using for centuries, he came up with a different solution entirely. He ordered his slaves to cover their bodies in honey. Here's something that makes this order even more striking. Honey wasn't cheap or easy to come by in ancient Egypt. Beekeeping was already a developed practice by this point, and honey was considered a valuable commodity used in medicine, in religious offerings, and in the diets of the wealthy. It wasn't something you poured out casually. And yet, according to the accounts that survive, Pepi II was willing to have it applied to human skin, day after day, purely to solve a personal annoyance. The cost in both honey and human dignity simply wasn't a consideration. Think about what that actually means for the person on the receiving end of that order. Every day you strip down and someone coats your skin in thick, sticky honey. Then you're positioned near the pharaoh, not to serve him food, not to fan him, not to guard him. Your entire function is to smell sweeter than he does, because that's exactly how it worked. Flies are drawn to sugar. A body covered in honey is, from an insect's point of view, an irresistible landing pad. So instead of the flies swarming around Pepi II, they swarmed around the servants standing beside him instead. This wasn't a one-time experiment either. Historical accounts describe it as a regular, established part of how his court operated. Naked, honey-covered attendants standing near the pharaoh as living insect traps, day after day for years. It's worth pausing here, because there's something almost absurd about how much effort went into solving such a small problem. Egypt at this time had access to real insect control. Egyptians planted basil and mint around homes because the smell repelled bugs. They used woven linen screens to cover food and doorways. Fly whisks made from horsehair or plant fiber were already a normal household item, used by everyone from merchants to shopkeepers. In other words, functional solutions to the exact same problem already existed. But Pepi II didn't want a fly whisk. He wanted the flies gone entirely, redirected somewhere else, using someone else's body instead of a tool. When you have that much unchecked power, even the smallest personal irritation can turn into an elaborate system built entirely around your comfort. And it says something about how ancient Egyptian society actually worked. This wasn't a hidden or shameful practice tucked away in private. It was documented. It was known. In a society where the pharaoh was considered a living god, where ordinary people weren't even allowed to say his real name out loud, an order like "cover yourselves in honey so the insects leave me alone" wasn't something anyone was in a position to question. Here's what makes this even stranger. Flies weren't universally hated in ancient Egyptian culture. In fact, quite the opposite. The fly was seen by many Egyptians as a symbol of persistence and courage because of how relentless and hard to get rid of they are. Soldiers who showed exceptional bravery in battle were sometimes awarded small golden fly pendants worn as a badge of honor. Fly-shaped amulets were crafted from gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and other valuable materials worn by people who believed the symbol offered protection from disease. So in the very same civilization where flies were minted into jewelry and given to war heroes as a mark of honor, one particular ruler was so bothered by them that he had human beings turned into sacrificial targets just to keep them away from his own skin. That contradiction is what makes this story worth remembering. It's not really a story about insects, it's a story about what unlimited power actually looks like at ground level. Most pharaohs are remembered through monuments, through pyramids, through inscriptions boasting about military victories or divine favor. Pepi II is remembered in part for something almost embarrassingly small, a minor daily discomfort, solved not through invention or compromise, but by making other human beings absorb the problem instead. It raises an uncomfortable question. How many decisions throughout history, big and small, were made this exact same way? Not because there was no better option, but because the person in charge had so much power that considering other people's discomfort simply wasn't necessary. And Pepi II is far from the only ruler in history who solved small personal irritations by placing the burden on someone else entirely. History is full of monarchs who reshaped entire households, entire staffs of servants around avoiding minor discomforts most people would simply tolerate. What makes his story stand out isn't that it's unique, it's that it survived in enough detail for us to still be talking about it thousands of years later. Most quiet cruelties from ancient courts disappear along with the people who experience them. This one oddly stuck around. Part of why it stuck around is because it's such a strange, specific image. Pyramids and battles and treaties are easy to summarize in a sentence. A man covered in honey, standing silently in the heat, while insects land on him instead of the throne beside him, is the kind of detail that's almost too specific and too strange to invent. It sounds like the kind of thing that gets exaggerated over centuries of retelling, and maybe some details have shifted slightly over time. But the core of it, a ruler so consumed by his own comfort that he turned other human beings into tools for avoiding minor inconvenience, fits everything else we know about how absolute, unchecked power tends to behave. 94 years is a long time to rule anything. Long enough that, by the end of his reign, historians believe the stability of Egypt's old kingdom had already begun quietly falling apart, worn down by decades of a single unchecked ruler. Pepi II didn't build an empire that outlasted him. What outlasted him instead was this one strange, specific detail. A servant standing silently in the Egyptian heat, covered in honey, waiting for the flies to land somewhere other than the throne.